Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Data Playbook. Now that I've gone through the Sunday 1 o'clock games, I'm going to do the 4 o'clock games in the same format as before. So let's get to it. And getting into our next matchup, you have Green Bay at Arizona, with Green Bay favored on the money line pretty heavily, and a spread of 7 points, with a total line of 44.5. Notably here, Green Bay is the best at stopping the rush in the league. They also have a pretty good rank with passing and scoring overall. However, they're not very good at stopping scoring. However, they're not great at stopping their opponents at scoring. They do have a decent rushing rank and a decent allowed passing rank, so they should be able to shut down the Cardinals, you would think, pretty well. If we look at the Cardinals rankings, they're pretty sub-average of scoring. They certainly are very bad at stopping the pass, and they don't have a great passing rank. They're about average for rushing and about average at stopping the rush. In terms of PPR, they're one of the worst teams at averaging PPR with only 80.4 PPR points per game. And Green Bay, one of the better ones, at 8 with fantasy PPR at 92.07 PPR points per game. And I'll just switch the stats up to the averages. The totals were there before if you need to go back and look at those, but these are now the averages, which do correlate with the ranking numbers. And the quarterbacks for this game are Jordan Love and Kyler Murray, who is still questionable but looks to play. Kyler averages 15.5 PPR points per game, while Jordan Love averages 17.8 PPR points per game. Jordan Love has had 2 interceptions this season with 1 loss, sack, fumble, and Kyler Murray has 3 interceptions this season with 1 rushing fumble loss. If I switch over to the averages, these are their averages for passing and rushing, and the breakdown down here if you need to look at their passing week by week. Looking at our running backs, you have Michael Carter starting for Arizona and Josh Jacobs on Green Bay. He averages 20.9 fantasy points per game, which is really good for a running back. And Michael Carter has averaged almost 9 fantasy points per game. Breaking down their averages, this is what you get. And of course, the breakdowns of week by week are down here. Of course, Carter is probably a little handicapped from this first week with only 1 rushing yard and 1 carry. So keep that in mind when it comes to his averages. Your number 1 receivers in this game are Matthew Golden and Marvin Harrison Jr., with Golden getting just under 8 fantasy points per game in PPR, and Harrison averaging 11.3 fantasy points per game in PPR. If we switch over the averages, these are their numbers if you need them. And of course, the breakdown down here, again, noting that Golden had 1 week with 0 receiving yards, so might bring down his average, but he was targeted twice, did not have any receptions, so it's a legitimate game, unlike some of the other players that we've seen. With that said, Matthew Golden does get somewhere over 15%. The number's not here, but it's got to be about that. Maybe just under 20%, maybe 18 or 17%. Harrison over here does get 30% of the team's receiving share, so that's pretty significant, and the largest share of anybody else. And then looking to the next set of receivers, you have Dobbs and Wilson, with Wilson only getting 4.6 average fantasy points per game, and Dobbs getting 13.08 average fantasy PPR points per game, so not a bad backup or a second receiver. If I switch it over to the average yards per game, there you have it. And of course, their receiving yards per game here. With their actual percentages, you get Romeo Dobbs with 28.2% of the air share receiving yards on the team, which is actually larger than Matthew Golden and anybody else. And over here with Michael Wilson, you get 18.5, 18.6% of the air receiving share. And ending up with our tight ends, you have Tucker Kraft and Trey McBride. Trey McBride getting almost 14 average fantasy PPR points per game, which is pretty good. And even Tucker Kraft with 12.6 is pretty good for what you'd want to see out of a tight end. And then switching over to the averages, go ahead and take a look. They're pretty close in their average receiving yards per game. And it comes down to the breakdown, especially with Tucker Kraft getting 124 receiving yards in week 2, but Trey being a lot more consistent. Trey does get almost 25% of the receiving yards on the team, which is a pretty large amount, especially for a tight end. Versus over here with Tucker Kraft, who gets maybe about 10%. So that's Green Bay going to Arizona, the matchup, and kind of how they compare. I'm not sure I have a lot of insight other than I would not expect a lot of rushing from Arizona. I imagine that would get shut down very quickly with Green Bay, and there'd probably be a lot of passing from Green Bay, especially with this allowed passing rank of 29. Expect a lot of passing is what I would presume between these two teams, but you never know. And there's your data for that game. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, leave a like and subscribe to see more, and leave a comment on what else you might want to see in the future. But otherwise, I'll see you next time.